Oh, get it.
This is Johna Till Johnson, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
I got to hurry up and get through your interview so we can get onto the theologian who we're not going to talk to theology about here on the Break It Down show today, Jonna. What do you think about that?
Well, I want to know seriously, Pete, how you came up with the idea for a show that has a science fiction writer, me, and a theologian talking about the impact of Martin Luther King on America. I'm like, that lineup I haven't seen anywhere else, and I would love to know where the idea came to you from.
It's so when I was a spy in like Iraq and Afghanistan, I would talk to everybody, right? And so you start to learn that the world is a lot more complex than you want it to be. And if you listen, you'll realize that there's richness all around you, right? And so like everybody's like, you have to have a niche, you have to have a niche. And I've been in this podcast game for a long time. And so I'm like, I don't know that you do because life is my niche because I happen to live in life. And so I am chasing Bono for when his book drops. I do want him. I do want my friend Grant to come on and talk about his dissertation that's not finished yet. I do want to talk about conflict. I do want to talk about social issues. I do want to talk to my friends who I find fascinating, and music. Why wouldn't I want to talk about all these things is really the question I would ask back, right? Why would I want to leave out anything?
You know, you are a man after my own heart, and I know Don Vandergriff, who strongly suggested we get connected, said you guys are going to like each other, and now I know why. Because when I was still in college, I remember one of my friends asking me, why are your friends always so like brilliant and good looking and charming and talented? And she was actually putting me down because I always described everybody in glowing terms. And I just looked at her and said, because you guys all just are.
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and that's it. If there, I used to have a Feynman quote that was, life is interested if you're interested, life is fascinating if you're interested in everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's interesting people all around. I belong to this group curated by a friend of mine named Josh, and it's one of those groups when you're belong to it, you're like, do they know I'm in this group? And then they're like, everybody has the same feeling, right? So you have like, I don't like very, 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 very notable authors, politicians, policy leaders, all these people, and they're like, why am I in this group? Like, this is like everybody's so great. And when you surround yourself with these great people, and one of the things about the show is that I get to meet a Don Vandergriff, who obviously, like in his own right, is just an incredible guy and an innovator. But also, I have access to his network, and I didn't ask him like, "Hey, who do you want me to have on the show?" He says, "Have John on the show," and I'm like, "Well, of course, yes. I don't. You don't need to convince me, you know. Just and that gift comes by being wide in my array."
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's funny, as you were talking, I thought I read a long time ago that there's basically two orientations towards life and towards science, and
Mm,
they're both incredibly important. One is an ongoing attempt to simplify and distill things down into their essence. So you're
yes.
constantly trying to figure out what can I get rid of. And the other is this desire to kind of learn more and more and grow and be more organic, and, I always wanted to be the first
Mm,
kind, and I do like to break things down as your show title is, into
yeah,
the sort of key things, but at the end of the day, I like the organic richness and the
yeah,
tapestry of life.
yeah. The breaking things down to their key elements, right? And it's
Mhm.
a very challenging thing. We struggle with modern conflict to get this right. We just think it's military, like it's only like it's a singularity, but it's not, right? There's people and there's stability and all these things, and they each have their own elemental aspects. I think Lincoln was good at finding the thing. And like when they had the Civil War, one of the things he realized, like there is a moral injury that's going to happen to this country, regardless of what we do.
Right.
And so he wasn't solving a problem. He was really kind of trying to mitigate a problem and didn't work. He got killed,
Yeah,
before he could finish it out. Right. But that's the thing in life is some of these problems, it's mitigation and no reliable path out.
yeah, I think Putin is thinking that right now, but I digress. Yeah, it's interesting, though, when you talk about distilling things down, because I was talking to a friend over dinner. And I know her through sailing. It's a long story, but I have lived aboard a boat for not years, but months.
Yeah.
And she lives aboard a boat, so we were just talking, and she said, "So, what exactly do you do?" And I said, "Well, my superpower actually is to be able to take things in." any complex system, any complex set of facts and data, and distill it down into what actually matters with the filter of a particular user, a particular requirement. So, for example, it's a sad example, but when my husband was dying of cancer, I read every scientific paper and every research paper, and I was able to say to his oncologist, who was extremely brilliant, "Hey, do you think he has this genetic condition that had nothing to do with the cancer, but would affect how he dealt with a particular chemo treatment?" And it was a random genetic aberration that happens to, weirdly enough, mostly people of Eastern European extraction and athletes and tennis players. It's overrepresented in tennis players. But anyway, it just has to do with how your liver processes enzymes. And I had been reading about all sorts of things, and I said, "Well, do you think he has this? Because I'm thinking he does." And she said, "Not only are you right, but I thought the same thing. And I've actually lowered his dosage of chemo because if he is susceptible to it, a full dose will kill him. So I'm giving him a half dose." And it turned out he had it. And I just remember thinking, yeah, that's actually not my background at all, but it
Yeah.
mattered. So it was important. And I read reams of papers and came away with this one thing.
We have this crazy gift to be able to access, all of these papers. I mean, you can
Yeah,
subscribe.
right.
If you're not getting them for free, you can subscribe for a very nominal fee and get access to anything. So if you're like, we are fighting cancer as a family, I'm going to research things. You can literally outpace your doctor who has
Oh,
the
yeah.
here and the now to worry about. And you're like, have you seen these 15 latest papers? And then the whole literature review within that I've been through and you can absolutely come in highly educated in this area because no one can know enough about these things individually. You can be the world expert, the leading expert, and there's still a guy who's going to make a left turn and find something that you didn't find that you can't possibly keep track of all of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not ever gonna be that leading expert oncologist. That's
Right.
not happening in this life. I probably, I actually dropped out of a scientific career partly because there isn't exactly room. I mean, there are some really well-known iconoclasts and people who can, put this. That's not the word I wanted, but anyway, that can put this kind of stuff together.
Sure.
But generally to get there, to be allowed to exercise that talent, you have to get really, really good at your silo. And that's an awful lot of work and an awful lot of depth. And that's not my superpower. I can do it, but it's not, there's always going to be people who do it a lot better.
Yeah. No, I love this. This is a great conversation. We're off to a great start. And I'm typing in something here on the screen because I'm trying to. Judith Rich Harris is an author who did. Yeah, sometimes your silo can be de-siloing, right?
Right.
So Judith Rich Harris, she was incapacitated and had to. But she wasn't a shut-in, but she was never really healthy in her adult life, and so she started typing, professional academic work for other people. Right, that was what she was able to do. But she was brilliant in
Mm.
her own mind, in her own right, and she realized in the behavioral sciences that everybody had all these silos and they couldn't see each other's work. And she was one of the first people to say, hey, by the way, when you're raising kids, genes matter more than you realize. And an adult parent who tries to do a good job of taking care of their kid, hard to make you show up reliably in the data because you just get crowded out by your genes, your wife's genes, or your husband's, whoever, and then your kids' genes and all the things around them. There's just no room for you to reliably do it. And it's absolutely counterintuitive. And then you look around, you're like, well, there's a family of 8 kids. Every single one of those kids is an individual, and you can't reliably make the same kid come. And it blows your mind when you start to de-silo, but you have to have those silos in the first place, right? So it's just not a paradox, but it's everything in life is a balancing thing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's funny too because when I was growing up just at the tail end of, on the nature versus nurture. That nature explained everything, and get the right tests, know who you are, and then you'll know who you're going to be in life.
Yeah.
And then we swung over, sort of politically and ideologically, to Kurt Vonnegut's "Everybody Must Be Equal." I can't remember which book that was, but I was just thinking about it the other day because you have to
Yeah.
handicap everybody in order for them to be at the same level. It was like, a very good-looking woman had to wear, like, ugly clothing and a
Yeah.
mask, and, someone with great vision had to wear distorting glasses and that kinda stuff. But and he was just making fun of the idea that we swung all the way over to the idea that there are no natural gifts and, you too could sing opera. And I'm like, I'm telling you, I can't."
I've been trying. It ain't working.
No.
There is definitely a certain so you have to have, and I don't know who knows if this is genetic or not, but like to work in opera, right? We had on the show here, we have a guy named Dennis Kim locally here in Orange County, who's the lead number one chair. He plays a Stradivarius, and he'll tell you that like he knows all of the canon of all of the songs, and he reads music wonderfully. But if you said, "Can you improvise?" He's like, "Nah, nope, nope."
Yep,
He's
jazz ain't me.
right. He's like a F1 car, right? Like highly specific. If you want an F1 car to haul your boat, wrong car, right?
Right.
So he has this beautiful multi-million dollar violin. He has this couple hundred, 200, 150-year-old music that he plays. And this is what he does. It is the essence of what he does. And then you take the guy who, there's another guy who's been on this show who plays the fiddle, as opposed to the violin, and he absolutely can improvise and do things. They both can be fantastically successful, but you can't be either one of these people if you don't have that determination that makes you, even if you're not the best violin player 8, 9, 10, 15, but if you just keep going and continue to winnow away all of the things that hold you back, you do end up in one of these different paths.
Yeah, it's actually reminds me of one of my favorite musicians, a guy named Davidas. He might be fun for the show, I don't know.
Nice.
Because he is the ultimate improviser. He's also a super, super nice person. He basically does a lot of when COVID hit, he had a nice gig as a professional musician, but COVID hit and, the bottom fell out of the performance market. So he started doing street busking in Florida. And actually, darn, I guess they were just hit by Ian. I didn't think of that. But basically his thing was he'd say, "What do you want me to play?" And somebody would say, name a song. And sometimes he'd know the song, but sometimes he wouldn't. And it would be a weird thing, like not Stairway to Heaven, but something like that, where every American knows it.
Yeah.
Well, he came from Eastern Europe, so he had a very spotty exposure. So he'd be like, "I don't know how that goes. Play it for me." And they'd, find it on YouTube, play a couple of
Yeah.
bars. And then he would do this rendition with multiple instruments, and it's not the song, but it's as interpreted by, and it's like it's genius. It's just really good what he does. And he's not the world's best musician on anything, but that ability to kind of say, "Well, let me hear that song, listen 3 bars and then take it."
Right. Right. A friend of mine and it's great because of the show. I don't make a whole lot of money because a little bit, but
Yeah.
what I get to do is meet people like you and this guy named Chris Thomas King, who everybody's familiar with him. He's won multiple Grammys. He's a blues musician, and he is like the progeny of blues people, and the progeny of those guys. Like he is just a linear blues king. And we were talking on the show one day. My buddy Scott asked him if he read music. He's like, "Yeah, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you play in his genre. He can just look and see, and he knows how to play that." And this is not like playing by ear. This is a mastery of like wherever it is, he will find a space within it and fill it with what he does. And there's this jazzy element to it, but it's incredible when you reach that level of mastery. But again, you have to be willing to give up a lot of other outcomes to be on the stage, to play, to make mistakes, to everything. All
Oh,
those things you
yeah.
have to do. You have to like say, I'm not going to be a black belt in any martial art. I am going
Right.
to be able to play this instrument. And then anybody who plays an instrument at a high level instantly says like I'm now a multi-instrumentalist because they play the harp in addition to the guitar and the bass. Oh, and I got to play the drum, and so you become this thing because you're on a path, and you get to stay on the path because you choose to stay on it still. So opera singer, look, Tom Waits doesn't have a euphonic voice. I mean, you're just like,
Mhm.
"Oh, that's the voice you pick," or Cyndi Lauper, but they found a way to stay on their path and get to where they needed to be. And we can all do that in theory, in Kurt Vonnegut's defense, but you have to be willing to cut your arm off to get there.
Well, I'm not sure about cut your arm off, but
Okay,
yeah, you
fair
have to
enough.
be focused on it. But I want to ask you a question because
Please.
when you raised this, it made me think of it. You said, "Well, he's the progeny of blues," and I'm wondering, do you think people, in addition to genetics, do you think they maybe get a head start being, growing up in a family like that? Because it could cut both ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it absolutely is there because it's not there's no fear involved, right? Like, if your kid says, "Hey, I
Mm,
think I wanna be a musician," most parents jump back and be like, "There's no money in that," right? This isn't the case, even though there was very little money in their family and music was a means to some kind of an ends, there was no fear of that employment. It's like, yeah, it's natural. Like, yes, sit in and experience it, and whatever you're doing, whether you're sweeping up the floor and his dad owned a juke joint,
mhm.
um, either you're doing that or you're talking to the old guy in the corner who has all these lessons. You're in it. You're experiencing it at a level that now. Look, we're not talking about something that requires very specific physical talent, right? I mean, anybody can play a guitar for the most part. But if you're talking like, can I be a world famous baseball player? I think there's a little bit too much speciality. But I don't know. What do you think?
I actually think, well, okay, so, there's a really great book by Scott Adams called How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Succeed Big Anyway. And that's actually what it's called, and it's illustrated. He's the Dilbert guy, so it's illustrated with all his cartoons. But his premise is dead serious. He's like, "I'm actually not very good at drawing. I'm kind of mediocre as a programmer. I did develop games for a living for a while." He worked in big companies, most notably, I think, Pacific Bell. Um, and he did a lot of things badly, and the synthesis of all those things that he did badly was Dilbert the cartoon, which succeeded wildly because there just wasn't anybody else talking about, technology for technologists in big companies, and making fun of the silliness of, large corporations and corporate IT. And I mean, he just nailed it because he had a good sense of humor. He had a great sense has a great sense of humor, could draw, well enough to get his ideas across, and badly enough so it wasn't intimidating. And he had this particular Venn diagram overlap of all these things. So his premise is essentially there's kind of two kinds of people. There's the very, very minor number of people that are born with a golden voice, as Leonard Cohen said jokingly, since he wasn't. He was one of the ones that didn't have a great voice.
Right.
Um, but they're the ones that are born with a golden voice and get it, and they compete
Mm,
in that rarefied atmosphere, and they get better and better and better and better and better. And then there's the rest of us. And he's like, "Look, this book is not for that 10% or 1% of you, because there's plenty of books. All the self-help books are for those guys.
yeah.
And the truth is, if you're one of them, you already know it. You have the genes and you have the desire and you have the drive, and you just need some world-class coaching. And I'm not a world-class coach, so go away or read the book for the comics." And he's like, "For the rest of you, think about diversifying your expertise. You don't have to be super deep in, deep
Yeah.
enough, as deep as you want to be, but you don't have to be the best coder on the planet, in order to know enough about coding to do interesting things, or, and so forth. It's just a matter of, do you also speak Portuguese? And are you also a windsurfer? And, so maybe you end up building an app for, Portuguese windsurfers or something."
Yeah. It really, literally anything, right? You have the
Yeah.
ability. My buddy learned how to code. He went to a code camp and struggled to find that first gig, but once he found it, what he did well was not necessarily code because he can do that, but you're supposed to hire people who are better at coding than you. But he was, look, he's just a likable guy and he's a good leader. He'd been in the military, and so he could get all of these coders to go in one common direction for long enough to get through a project. And they're like, "Hey, that's harder than coding." And so, you know,
Exactly. You have to know enough about coding to understand when I'm coming in complaining to you about blah blah blah, woof woof woof.
right.
But you don't have to know it better than I do. You just need to
Mm.
know enough to help me solve my problem. Yeah, I agree. Actually, the internet. Most people don't know this, and the internet. The study of how the internet was built is actually fascinating, because the mantra of the people that developed IP, the packet protocol, was rough consensus and running code. In other words, I don't care how great your standard is. Just get
Mhm.
it on paper and then build something and see if your thing talks to my thing. And if your thing talks to my thing, we've got something. And if it
Mhm.
doesn't, maybe we don't. But the guy that led it during its arguably its heyday in the 1990s was a guy who really will he'll tell you he was a senior, he was an engineering fellow or very high up in technology at Cisco. But he was not the best technologist. His brilliance was exactly that leadership. He's a great technologist, don't get me wrong, but he's not, the best of the best of the best. His brilliance was getting people to work together and very diverse people, which is not so easy in in high tech. He had men, women, Christians, Muslims, atheists, old, young. He really didn't care what you look like, where you came
Mhm,
from, what your
mhm.
background was. He wanted to understand what you were trying to do and help sort of shepherd that.
I can't I was trying to pull his name up here while we were talking. I can't remember his name, but, on my old show, Popping the Bubble, talked a lot about technology and crypto. One of the
Mhm.
guys, very, very notable guy said, "You can never bet against software engineers because they do that thing you're talking about. Like, look, I have a machine, you have a machine, but they don't talk." And then someone's like, "I can make those machines talk."
Right.
And then someone's also like, "Hey, I can make those machines talk better." And then they just spider web out the solution, and you can really, without a particular moment of brilliance, you can borrow someone else's brilliance and say, I can make that better, or I can make this do something else. And how many times have we had a breakthrough where something incredible happens in science or whatever it is? And or even in art. I mean, like Star Wars, there's a moment of brilliance right there. Opera in space. Okay, great. And now look at what's happened to it. There's got to be 20 of those dang movies now. It took forever to get them coming, but they're like, well, we can make more of that. We can expand the story. We can give these millions of people what they want. And even if they don't like this one, they're for sure gonna like the next one because all we got to do is bat about 500 here, and we'll be all right.
I have to admit, I am one of the science techies. I cannot stand Star Wars. I didn't like it when I was 11. I don't like it now. I've
Yeah.
never liked any of it. I mean, that's not true. I like the visuals and I love the theme song.
Mhm.
But I think I've tried to dissect it, and I
Mhm.
think, the acting is a little special, especially in the first ones, but I'm okay with that. I have a high tolerance for
Okay.
bad acting. I think the script is actually outrageously horrible, and
Yeah.
I am a written word person, so because I once heard a radio version of it, and I was like, "Oh, this is much better than I thought it was," and they had completely redone the script, so I think whatever. For whatever it is, I'm the one person that really doesn't like it. I mean, I'm a huge Star Trek fan,
Yeah.
and was always, a fan of the original Trek, but, um
There's there is a I don't even gonna go down that road.
yeah,
I
we
wanna
could
go back and go
yeah,
down.
we could yeah.
We were talking about like that was 1% that Scott Adams was like, "Hey, this is really isn't for you." And there are the people that are special. And one of the things I've tried to figure out, so I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, is how does someone go from being like capable, professional grade at X and become something bigger? And the examples that we talked about was this was a comedian. We were talking about Dave Chappelle. Like, and look, if you're a comedian who's been on the road for 25, 30 years, you can write the same jokes, right? Like a lot of these jokes are similar anyhow, but there's something about Dave Chappelle that makes him right now commonly recognized as the greatest of all time or a greatest living or whatever. And we're not making a political statement here. We're just talking about peers, talking about Dave
Right.
Chappelle. So there's something in what he does. And then this comedian, used President Obama as an example. He's like, here's a guy that has no business being the president based upon his resume, but he had something that we all were desperate to have, and he still has it. It's not so much about performance, but he had the ability, like this shaman like thing, this Jim Morrison thing, to make us all look at him and go, yeah, we love this, right? And he's adored. I mean, we have to admit, like, he's adored. People love him. They love his wife, and probably the most adored president that we've had in, gosh, probably in my lifetime. And it's so there is something at that end of the spectrum where even if you have the professional skills, you still have to have that it.
Well, it's interesting as you started talking, I listened, but I was also mentally pushing back, and as you kept
Good,
talking, I was sort of shaping my pushback. And I'm gonna answer this with a complete sideline
good.
because, so one of the things, think about sociopathy. We have learned an enormous amount about sociopaths, also called antisocial personality disorder people,
Right.
in the past 30 years. One of the things that we've learned is, for one thing, they're not all serial killers. In fact, most of them aren't, although most of them would kill somebody if they got in their way.
Right.
But the thing about a sociopath that is really beguiling, the question is, how can a sociopath, so many people have had relationships with them and said, oh my God, that's what I was dealing with. And the answer is because they're brilliant, brilliant at reflecting back to you what you want to see, what you're yearning for, what you don't even know you want right now, right here. And I think the people that you gave as examples, I'm not saying any of them are sociopaths, but I think they have a slightly different skill, which is to reflect back to intuit and reflect back to large numbers of people something they want to see and feel and hear at a time. I mean, we needed, I guess, desperately to see someone who was calm, who was cool, who was quiet, who was whose style was the
Right.
antithesis of hot and screaming, and that would be Obama. And what made me think about this was I was sort of pushing back a little bit because I thought about I'm reading a biography of G.K. Chesterton at the moment.
Mm,
Fascinating, fascinating guy. But what's really interesting in the biography is they're writing about the intelligentsia of Britain in, 1905. And basically, most of the people we've completely forgotten. And
right.
only that, like, at the time, there were all people who were luminaries, and a handful of them are stuck around. C.S. Lewis, we all know who
Sure.
he was, G.K. Chesterton. But most of them just disappeared. And so, what you're really asking is the difference between the ones that we've all forgotten about
Right.
and the ones that stuck around. And I think it's that. I think it's that ability to reflect back to society, meaning all the
Mhm.
people in aggregate, what they want to see.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. The permanent marketability, at least thus far, of Elvis, right? Elvis is
Right.
hot again. He's charting again,
Well, that's because of the movie.
Right,
There's
but you
there's
make a
actually a
movie
really
because he's
good movie.
relevant. You know,
Not
he has
really. You just sort of pick somebody who's kind of a in fact, they almost, what do they call it? Reverse casting or whatever. They
okay.
they basically picked somebody who was, nobody cared about Elvis and did I think a brilliant movie. It was visually brilliant, and it was also intellectually insightful.
Mm,
And now, I mean, I was playing Elvis on the way home from the movie, and I'm sure everybody else was too, because it
yeah,
sounded different now that we had a different look at this person. But
yeah,
yeah, he was essentially connecting. I mean, he was connecting two different
mm,
strands in America. One was the lively, vital, hot, passionate, black culture at the time. And the other was the repressed, sort of tamped down, controlled, but yearning white
yeah,
culture. And the point they made was, essentially you could call it a cultural appropriation, but it was basically a white guy singing black music to people who were starved for it, who also had personal charisma and personal greatness.
yeah, 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 it's interesting. I'm gonna push back a little bit on the Elvis thing because he
Okay.
continues to be multimillionaire in earnings every year since he's been dead. He's made way more money dead than he did alive, right? And so there is an element that, like, this is not somebody from another planet, and we're not making a smash hit with charting stuff with someone who was, like, I don't know. I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis is still alive, but they
Okay.
made another movie about
Fair
him.
enough. He's not some totally forgotten. I mean, he's still an icon. Yeah. I mean,
Right, right. But there is something to be said for being dead and relevant, right? And what you were able to do. Mozart gets played every day in this country in some place because he puts butts in seats, and the dude's been dead for, gosh, I mean, he died like in 1792, and so he's been dead a long time. But then again, and we'll use my buddy Bob Greenberg. He talks about, like, the Greenberg laws, like, so my dad lived, 95 years. And if he was born the day a 95-year-old guy died, and then that guy
mhm.
was also born, you're back before the beginning of this country even existed, and
Oh,
this is a
easily.
crazy
Easily.
fact. President John Tyler has grandkids, not great grandkids, not great great grandkids, grandkids that are still alive. And
Mhm.
he was president way back. He's like the
Well,
12th
but
president.
some of that, I mean, I see what you're saying, but some of that is this is a really young country because I remember
Yeah.
being 11 years old in 1976
Mm.
and kinda going, bicentennial, pretty cool. I think
Yeah.
I'll stick around for the next one." And I
Yeah.
realized 3 things. One is I'd have to be really lucky because that was
Yeah.
gonna be another 100 years.
Yeah.
The second one was, hang on though, if I do that, the country will be
Ah,
50% older than it is today in my lifetime.
right.
Holy
Yeah.
cannoli. And the
Yeah.
third thing was, hey, what if it's not here then? I
Mm.
mean, given how young it is, it's not entirely guaranteed that it's going to be here. I know I was a little bit of a precocious 11-year-old, but I
Yeah.
remember thinking all three things and then just going, well, I'll just settle on trying to live as long as I can to see how the story comes out.
Yeah. Can we call it live as well as we can for as long as we can?
Well,
'Cause
yes.
our
Well well, I don't I don't share what a lot of people are like, "Oh my god, I don't wanna be 95 if I can't do what what I
right.
wanna be able to do." Well, first of all,
Yeah.
my mother's 95 and she can't do everything she used to do. She was a basketball player, she was a skier,
Yeah.
you know? After a certain age, you gotta get used to the fact that there's certain physical things that you're just not
Yeah.
gonna be able to do, and at
Right.
some point, you start realizing that quite a lot of them aren't as important as you think they were, even
Mm.
if you're an intensely physical person.
Yeah.
Um, so the idea that your quality of life necessarily degrades if using a walker or sitting in a chair, I can prove that's not necessarily the case. So
Yeah.
I don't really, yes, I would prefer to be skiing in my 90s like many people in Norway,
Right.
for instance, do. But, you know, hey, some people can't make it past their 30s and still ski. They lose a limb or whatever,
Yeah.
you know.
And it is up to the person to, Atul Gawande is great. He writes about this,
Mhm.
being mortal and what we think our parent or loved one might want to be maybe completely out of scope with what they're satisfied with. One of the examples was this daughter of a man who was a professor. He's like, "No, you know what? As long as if I'm just basically a neck and a brain, that's it. That's all I really am. I
Mhm.
can still professionally write. I can watch football." She's like, "You even like football?" He's like, "I haven't had time."
Yeah,
So
Stephen Hawking is the case in point.
right.
And the other thing is you don't get the other worry is that as you get old, you get jaded.
Mm,
At the beginning of the spring, when the war had just started in Ukraine, my dad was a naval officer, so I grew up like being in the middle of the Cold War. So, my generation basically thought we were at peace and I thought we were at war. And I still think that the next war should be called World War III because we already had
right.
World War II. But that's just me. Um, but I was looking at what was going on between Russia and Ukraine and knowing how out of options Putin is and thinking, I don't see any good ending to this. And a lot of the endings I see end up with nuclear war. This was back when we really didn't know how it was going to go. So I was visiting my mother and I just got struck by an uncharacteristic bout of sentimentality. And I said, I just want to say goodbye and that I love you. And I may not see you again because it's getting a little crazy out there talking about the war.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to frighten you. And my mother just looked at me and said, "Oh, stop. Your father was a naval officer. He went on nuclear patrols. The first 4 times he left, it was like a funeral. I thought the end of the world would happen. He would never come back. After that, I figured, what the heck? And then
Right.
I started to live, and nobody promises us tomorrow. So we may not see each other again. And
Yeah.
that in this life, but I love you, and we probably will, and we did. So, I just thought, people were like, "Oh my gosh, you talked to your mother about such, you know,
Yeah.
possibility of nuclear war, you didn't wanna scare her?" I'm like, "She had a better perspective than I did."
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for that perspective, and we do definitely borrow a lot of trouble on
We
things that
do.
we just really cannot control at all, and that trouble might be big nuclear war trouble, and it might be like drinking out of a plastic bottle trouble. Like, hey,
Right.
it's somebody you can't worry about and battle everything because you can't control the outcomes. It's just,
Yeah.
you know and honestly, look around, it's not that bad. It's
And
there's not
right, exactly. I mean, there's lots of things, in a sense, there's lots of things we could change. And it's a good idea, to drink out of a non-plastic bottle if you have the choice, but
right.
like stressing that you're causing the end of the world by drinking out of a plastic bottle. I mean, if you want to be
Mm,
miserable, you do that. But, if you can do something about it, do that thing, and if you can't, what is that? The grant me the wisdom to
right.
know the difference between what I can change and what I can't.
There is definitely some need for that type of a mantra, right? We look at plastic, and whether you're ingesting it or it's going into the ocean, and we're desperate to deal with it. Here in California, we're trying to get rid of straws. And then you look down the grocery store aisle, and there's 1,000 pounds of plastic that's gonna maybe get recycled, maybe not. And then you think about if I went to the Horn of Africa and I walked around, or I went to the Arab world, not to pick on Arabs, this is a fact. They don't pick up trash. They don't
Right.
bag trash. And so the trash that's getting out there is, I'm not saying that we're innocent and we're, virginal with our
Right.
plastic use, but if you want to solve this problem, I promise, if you go to Djibouti and you go police up the plastic that you see, you will have a 1000x impact over drinking out of a plastic straw.
Yeah, I mean, I do think though there's a, to take a phrase from the
Yeah,
'60s, there's a consciousness awareness thing, a consciousness raising thing where even when I was growing up, we didn't use plastic the way we do now. I mean,
right.
sometimes, go to the grocery store and somebody shrink saran wraps a banana. I'm like, "No, the banana comes in its own wrapper. Come on, people."
No.
So it's like really we don't need it. And it turns out there's fascinating things that are better than plastic. Like most of us think, "Oh, okay, wood," but wood, cloth, metal actually all have great advantages. So it starts to become a game a little bit. I mean, I know I'm just picking on one thing, not the grand premise with which I agree, but it turns out to be kind of fun to ask yourself, am I using plastic? Is there a way to avoid using plastic? And what would it take for me to do that and what would be the impact? So,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking up right now because I recall, I don't know, this has been a while now, but we buy a lot of packaged water and a lot of it
yeah,
comes in plastic. And there's a belief that, hey, the water I'm drinking, and I know New York City has had several campaigns like, you can drink this water, but
right.
we don't. We refuse to. And then like we've tested our water here and found out, oh, you know what, like it's perfectly fine to drink. It is a little hard. Maybe we treat that aspect of it as opposed to buying plastic water. But, it's awfully convenient to go buy a 32 pack of waters or, Fiji's or whatever it's going to be that you can afford. And there it is. You know how lucky we are. And I'm saying this to the audience, less than you, to have potable water to just
Mhm.
defecate in, like without
Right, I know.
exceedingly, and then just push a button and have it go away and never think about it again.
Right.
Like, that is the definition of decadence and opulence to have that ability. Like, much I have so much more.
Yeah, yeah, and I would sort of prefer that we not, because now that you've raised the flush toilet, you've touched on one of my one of my hot buttons, so to speak. I would love to see the entire universe transition over to composting toilets, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I just
In the right, yeah,
I just find that the engineering of them to be amazing, and the problem is people are squeamish, so it's
sure.
really difficult to get people to think about
Reclaimed
it.
water,
Oh
purified,
gosh, yeah,
not
right.
drink it. Like, oh, heaven forbid we do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, no. But yeah, if I could change one thing about the world, it would be
Mm.
to make everybody happily use composting toilets. The happy part is the hard part, but
Okay, so I'm gonna give you that one, and we'll get there. But you
right.
should have something else on your list. If I made you president right now, and you're not king or queen, you're just like, I'm going to push this initiative. What's the one? What are you going to push besides composting toilets?
I probably wouldn't push composting toilets because, I mean, you said president, not, king or queen or
Right.
or
Yeah.
universe, and, so there you have to balance, look at everything else, balance budgets, blah blah.
Yeah.
And I
Right.
mean, that's, right now, hey, we're a debtor nation. That's not going to end well, but okay, let's assume that gets fixed. I think, I am concerned about that, and I'm not sure what the fix is because my
Mm.
economics background is a little weak in some areas.
Right.
But to answer the question behind the question, like, what do you think is a top priority? I would really love to revisit the educational system in this country from top to
Mm.
bottom. I've been lucky enough to go to be educated both primary and secondary education outside this country. Not entirely. I can compare and contrast, and I could give you a laundry list of things I think we do wrong.
Right.
Um, but I would love us to revisit the whole notion. We have right now a massive culture war about education, which makes no sense. It's a
Mhm.
manufactured war. Um, you know, and of course, people are always saying, that the teachers are either evil incarnate
Mm.
or,
Mhm.
these poor, under-supported angels, and the truth is neither. And there's just so much we could fix, and a big chunk of it is defining the problem correctly. And,
Mhm.
there's always talk of charter schools and things like that. I know in New York there are examples of cases where people will start with super underprivileged kids, like kids that are just not set up to succeed, and become successful through kind of a holistic approach that's also, loving discipline. And it almost gamifies discipline in a way. And there's just so much you can do. And if we fix that, everything downstream. I won't say everything's golden, but essentially what we've done is raise an army of people who are well educated, who know how to think and know how to solve problems, and they'll fix all the other stuff. So, when you talk about breaking it down and cutting to the chase, that really, if you fix how people are educated, you fix how the next generation solves problems. As long as we can refrain from making any ones that are too bad for that generation to grow up, we're good.
Yeah. The I just had Kim Husing, Dr. Kim Husing on the show because we were talking about administration of a school district and all of the things that go into that. And this kind of goes back to the plastic conversation. Like, you can feel bad that there are Syrian refugees in some kind of floating vehicle trying to get across, from here to wherever they can get to. You can feel bad about plastics, but do you give a damn enough to give a damn and go get to work, right? And this is sort of the big question. Like, you can complain about education, but what Kim would say is, if you are a parent, you've got certain basic responsibility: feed your kid, get your kid rest, make sure they're ready for school, make sure that you're not evil when they get there, if that's at all possible. But if that's, you want to do more, then get involved, and go through the process. Talk to the teacher first, and
Yeah,
that doesn't work.
but I don't think we can change. I mean, there's fundamental changes. Just to give you an example,
Yeah,
a very simple example, which is absolute heresy, and everyone will tell me I'm wrong, except that it works great in Europe.
yeah.
Which is, get rid of school sports, get rid of school, extracurricular activities. School should be school. And,
Okay.
oh, by the way, we're talking not, 8 hours a day, but like 4 or 5 hours a day of
Mm,
school,
mhm.
tops. When I went to high school, an elite high school in Italy, we went to school at 9 and we were back at 1 for lunch, and then we had the afternoon for ourselves. And, oh, by the way, I'm not saying don't do sports.
Right.
Absolutely do sports, but do sports as a neighborhood sports league. And you
Yeah.
can be highly competitive there, or do drama, or do your, unless it's a theater school. But,
Sure. Yeah.
do like in because that does a lot of things. What that does is, for the kid in the middle of it, it gets rid of this artificial hothouse that we have right now, where high school is this tiny miniature world, except a world that's not like real life, because everybody in it is like, everybody in your soccer team is also a classmate.
Oh,
And
yeah.
you never see that in real life. And it creates all kinds of toxic dynamics that make no sense.
Yeah.
Plus, it skews things, because people are like, I don't care about school. I care about the football team. Well, I'm like,
Yeah.
you know what? That's great. Have a football team, go play football, but don't have it have anything to do with school, because they have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And stuff like that, most Americans would say heresy,
Yeah.
burn the witch. And I'm like, I'm sorry, it works great in Europe.
Yeah.
And now there's lots of corollary problems that it raises. For example, because really what we don't want to acknowledge right now is school is daycare for working parents. And that's an actual problem, because if worked in Italy, when in that generation, because I could come home and, I was staying with the nuns, but
Mhm.
you could come home and your mom was there to serve you lunch, because that's what moms did, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then all afternoon, nobody had to cart anyone from point A to point B
Mhm.
and drive you in a car, because you were living in a city and you could get there on you. So there's a whole lot of ancillary things that need to get changed. One of our commenters is saying, oh, I'm for sports as physical education promotes brain health. And that's absolutely true. But there's no need for sports to be part of
Mm.
the your education, and from the standpoint of learning. You can be learning lots of other things and have sports separately. So there are entirely different structures. My mother looked at me, my 95-year-old mother looked at me recently and said, I just wish we'd sent you to one of those colleges where you could study anything,
Yeah.
whatever interested you. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that I kind of did that. So, she thought I might have been more
Yeah.
successful if she'd done that. And I'm like, you got what you got.
To your point on the sports in school, first off, you could, in America, this is great. You can start your own school and you build this thing, right? It's incredible. You can do that. But the other thing is when you look at elite athletes who are going to be Olympians or whatever it's going to be, you know what they don't do? They don't spend 6 or 7, 8, in school. They get their schooling done. They appear to, or when you look around, I mean, you're like, hey, this person's intelligent, and they managed to get in 3 workouts today or whatever it is, but they weren't trapped in this environment, which really doesn't suit a lot of kids. I mean, you talk about a hard thing. Young
Yeah.
boys are not wired to sit still for 6 hours at the age of 6, like, they need to go run around and, like, smell stuff and run their face into things, and that's sort of how,
I think you're correct, but I would add girls to that. People think girls are hardwired to sit still and color nicely, but
Yeah,
actually they're probably a little more docile. I mean, I'm not arguing that there aren't sort of broadly speaking differences in groups,
right.
but
I
most of the
was leaving
girls
the ladies for you to handle, that's the one thing, like,
basically one of the things I've noticed is kids generally, and in fact, adults actually shouldn't be sitting there working
yeah,
for 8 hours straight doing anything.
yeah,
Um, you know, so yeah, I think there's an entirely different way, but as much as you say, "Oh, well, we could just start a school," I'm looking at it differently. It's like,
mm,
it doesn't help if I went to the school, but nobody else did.
right,
You end up with people who are, I'm not saying, "Oh, by the way, let's, force everyone to go to school the way Johna
sure,
wants to go to school." I'm saying, let's set up a public school system that is open to experimentation, to figuring out how to make things better, that does things like disaggregate sports from, from school, and focuses on making the school piece really, really good, and let
mhm,
somebody else deal with making the sports piece really, really good.
mm,
But you want to have a common level playing field for everyone, literally, so that everybody can come in and say, okay, everyone's got that start that is at least designed to be as optimal as we can make it. Um, and, I had another really wildly insane thing that I would change is
yes,
I would change college, completely, because here's the other thing. 18-year-olds are not wired to go sit in a classroom and think about intellectual things.
yeah,
A very small subset of us are, and we're intellectuals and we're nerds and whatever. Most people wanna go build things, make things, including making babies. Funny, it's
sure,
what you wanna do very much when you're
very
18 to
much so.
28 to
How you're
38.
programmed
Oh,
genetically.
it turns out that's actually kinda sort of the right time to do it. The
Yeah,
reason everybody doesn't is because we've structured college on a very male trajectory, where it's like, just go ahead and repress all those desires for 5 or 10 years, and then you get to have them. For women, that doesn't work at all because you've just shot, 5 years of your prime childbearing experience. What I would love to see is university being something that was much broader, so you go to it when you're ready, and for women, not all women, but for some women, that may not be
sure,
till you're 35 and the kids are grown,
sure.
and you shouldn't have a required dorm and sororities and fraternities and all that nonsense. It's like, if you really wanna go to university because you really wanna learn astrophysics or English literature, that's what it should be about. You know, it's not about hanging out in a dorm and, smoking dope or drinking beer or whatever, and not
Yeah,
not that I'm opposed to that. It's just,
sure.
it's that part is so overrated compared to, people say, "Oh, but I learned the most from the people I hung out with." Yes, hang out with them and have intellectual discussions by all means, but you don't have to, have it be daycare for young adults.
I mean,
So,
for sure, military members on
mm,
whole do a lot better coming back as a 24
yep.
or 25-year-old with
Oh,
school paid
absolutely.
for, and they just have professional working skills that an 18-year-old, they're just gonna lap those guys. It's just not gonna
Yeah,
be hard. I wanted to, there's the
yeah.
I've been exploring this topic, and I'm curious how you think about it. We talk about diversity. It's very much a watchword right now, and it's a
Mm.
wonderful goal to have, but diversity and unity are antonyms. And so you have to balance the ability to be unified enough to accomplish these incredible things. But if you get too much unity, then you get a little authoritarian. But if you have too much diversity, you've got cats everywhere who are the most important cat ever, and you can't go in one direction. How do you balance unity and diversity so that it's a healthy thing?
From my experience, the simple thing is to have respect for the history and worldview of other people. And because I'm reading Chesterton, a great quote of his comes to mind. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it was a brilliant sort of observation. And he said, it's very funny when you read these people that talk about how, we need to integrate everyone and bring everyone to a common understanding, it's always, and he didn't say it this way, but it's always a bunch of white colonialists, telling people from other cultures to do it their way.
Yeah.
Nobody ever says, "Oh, this school teacher needs to know how to ride a camel or, hunt, hunt sharks like an Eskimo." Those skills aren't worth having and don't matter and don't, and I'm putting air quotes around it, don't
Mhm.
count.
Yep.
And I think that's where the weakness is, to be able to say, "Okay, look, Western civilization values XYZ PDQ, and here's why, and here's what's good about it. And non-Western civilization men think this, or some men think this, or, whatever, and women think this." And having the openness to other perspectives also dodges the whole issue of kind of trivializing diversity right down to skin color and
Right.
orientation, and because all of us know that you're more than the sum of your parts.
Please. Yes, of course, right? We
Right.
have to
So
do that. Yeah.
so the idea that, okay, let's think about the fact that everybody's life story has value, everybody's culture has value, and that for certain purposes some cultures may have greater value than others. The South Americans who can live and function at 5,000 degrees to 5,000 feet to 14,000 feet most comfortably. Yeah, I
Right.
can't do that. I get altitude sickness literally at 9,000 feet. It's scary. um so yeah, I mean, there's just, I think the balance is in saying, okay, is this a time when we need to be open to absolutely everybody's perspective, or is this something where it's, let's batten down the hatches because we've got a storm, and we've got to focus on keeping the boat afloat or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, that explains the diversity half and the benefit of it, but, we also have this deeply, they say polarized. I would say that there are 3 poles in this. It's not bipolar, it's tripolar, where you have, folks in the middle and folks on the left, folks on the right. If we don't get some kind of unity, you don't get to stay together very long, right? You have these problems, and then other things take over, right? The competition. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. Just do a good job. Don't lie to me. Don't do these
Well,
other things. But it's ripping people apart. And so there's that
well,
unity piece, right? How
well,
do
the
we?
unity comes around principles, and the challenge is which principles are fundamental and which principles are not.
Okay.
But, for example, one of the reasons I get really irritated about a lot of the culture wars around this country, just a stupid thing, for example, the Department of Homeland Security.
Mhm.
There is no freaking homeland. Not even the Native Americans were, originated here. They came over the Bering Strait. There
Sure.
is no homeland. And more to the point, we're not defined in the United States by where we were born. That's the whole point.
Mhm.
If you're an immigrant, you came over, you passed the tests, you became a citizen. You did that because you actually believe in what we set up here with this democratic republic experiment. You're buying into a whole bunch of principles that should be the unifying thing. That should be the factor. You may say, well, I think this principle is a little more important than that principle. The Second Amendment matters more than the First Amendment, or the first, whatever.
Yeah.
But we have to agree that that the fundamental idea that there are civil liberties that we are entitled to, and they're not given to us by the people in power. That's a fundamental difference between us and pretty much anyone else,
Everyone else. Yeah.
originally. And we have to agree that that's actually the case, that rights are rights and they're not something that somebody gave us,
Yeah.
So I think the challenge for unity is figuring out what principles we can agree on,
Mm.
as opposed to, as opposed to sort of which ones or
Yeah.
which issues we disagree on, and the issues may not even be principles.
Yeah. Yeah, we get fed a lot of issues too. You're like, "Gosh,
Yep.
can we stay focused?" I remember when, President Bush the, younger ran, and one of his main planks and part of his mandate was he was gonna fix Social Security. Well, I'm still waiting. I thought we were gonna and then we were gonna fix, infrastructure, how every election, and then we we never do, right? And so we get distracted by these things. Okay, I wanna get away from that stuff, and I
Yep.
wanted to,
Politics
get
is too easy a trap, even in the generic.
yeah, yeah, but I think we talked about the diversity and unity thing in a way that's healthy. I wanna talk a little bit about, so you like to get out on the water. I'm a swimmer. You like to paddle, either boards or kayaks or whatever it's gonna be, but you also like to have goals, like, around Long Island or around Manhattan and everything. When, as someone who doesn't do that kind of thing, I think, gosh, I guess that's possible. I mean, if you can do it 60 plus times or 7 or however many times you go around whatever island you're going around. But does there become like, what is the point? Is it a point to, because no one cares if like, oh, you went around Long Island 15 times. I don't care. Why is this important to you and what do you get out of it?
Um, it's a great question, I think, because it brings you completely 100% into the moment. Whatever whatever you've trained, however you've prepared, you have to be able to figure out what to do at any given moment in time, and that's not as easy as it looks, let me just put it that way.
Mhm.
Keeping in mind that once you start kayaking longer than about 20 miles, depending on who you are, the longest I've ever gone at one stretch is about 60 or 70 miles,
Yeah.
without sleeping, without getting out of the boat, is what I mean by one stretch. Once you get past that, you're gonna have to figure out where you're going to camp.
Mhm.
Hint, there's probably not a legal spot, so where is a spot that you're going
Yeah.
to get away with? But you're probably not gonna get shot by the homeowner because that would be sad.
Yeah.
And so forth and so on. You've got to kind of figure out, oh, by the way, what are the tides and currents going to be? So is
Right.
that place going to be underwater when you wish, it weren't, like in the
Yeah.
middle of your night or whatever. So I think that the challenge of figuring out all of that, um, also also combined with, especially for kayaking, and I really am a kayaker. I've paddleboarded a little bit, but I'm really a kayaker. Um, there's just plain a feeling to doing long, really long exercise. Long distance runners talk about it. It's meditative, it's
Mhm.
calm, but it's also, your muscles are pumping, the blood is going to your brain, so you get different ideas. You spin free even though you stay very focused. And so there's kind of three parts of your brain. One part is just meditating, almost like counting your breath. I mean, for me, I'm thinking about my forward stroke. One part is thinking up crazy new ideas. Hey, I could build this thing. I always get ideas for things I could build. And then yet another one is like, oh, wait a minute. Is that storm cloud? Is that a big storm cloud or a little storm cloud? Have I checked the radar recently? What's coming? Can I make it to the next spot before the storm hits? So you're very much in the moment, but the moment is in these multiple dimensions.
I love it. Yeah. I like to swim. I am not a fast swimmer, but I can swim indefinitely. You put me in a pool and I'll just go hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is. I'm really limited by the access to the pool more than anything else. I don't
But
swim in open water very often just because it's just an added risk and I don't consider that to be a benefit. But you do have a meditation. And at some point, like I'm swimming for time. And so I'm not worried about how many laps or how many breaths or whatever. I've reduced all of that. Sometimes I focus on the numbers just because it's a good mental
right.
exercise. Think about how many strokes am I going to take today and 100, whatever it is, right? But the inspiration, the things that you allow to flow into your head and live there with them and push them away. Sometimes they're scary and evil, and you're like, I can handle this. I'm in a pool. Let this happen. And you work on things, right? And there's brilliant ideas. And then it's impossible to get out of the pool and be like, I feel like crap. Like you
Hmm.
feel like a superhero. And there's something primordial in it. Like it's just the essence of human, like to go out and look at a cloud and think, hmm, um, is that going to be a problem for me? Or whatever it is, I'm going to have to eat at some point. And all of these things that we had to do 10,000, 20,000, however many thousand years ago, these are the same things. You put yourselves in these positions to be as human as you can be. I mean, there is risk in kayaking around an island, right? You might get shot by somebody. I mean, gosh, who knows? Like that. Remember that guy that swam around the UK about 6 years ago?
Hmm.
At one point, he had a jellyfish stuck to his face.
Oh,
Yeah, and you can quit in that moment or whatever, right? There's also that thing of like one more stroke or one more step or one more turn of this.
well, and I think there's another thing because as you're describing that, it makes me think of all the fun pain you end up with as a
Yeah.
kayaker, and it's you never people think, "Oh my gosh, your arms must hurt." It's never your arms, number 1.
Mhm.
If you're doing it right, it's your torso because it's torso rotation. But never mind that, it's always like chafing in some form is always
Yeah.
gonna kill you. And I've never not been badly chafed at the end of a long paddle or had bad blisters or both. And one of my friends was really tough guy, a Norwegian, and we were doing a 50-mile paddle out in the open water, and he looked at me at one point, and he was just suffering, and I'm like, this is a tough guy whose actual day job at the time involved going into emergency zones and setting up communications networks for them. I
Right.
mean, this, really
Love it.
hardcore,
Yeah.
And I said, and he said, "How can you enjoy this?" And I said, "Well, the trick is to see the beauty despite the pain. And the more you practice that, the better it is for life."
Yeah. 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 That's a perfect spot. Hey, I don't want to take any more of your time. We've talked for an hour, and that was a wonderful way to stick the landing. Anything in closing, and let's do this again soon.
Absolutely, I'd love to. Yeah, I think I think if there's a common theme, because it's all about breaking it down and coming to the common themes. I think the common theme about everything we've talked about is stay open.
Mm.
And that's always good to think about, especially here where I am on a sort of closed, rainy day, feeling like you want to just close in on yourself. Sometimes it's important to just stay open.
I love it. I love it. All right, stand by for 1 second. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much